this talk came out of a conversation that Joe and I have been having around talking about psychological safety in teams. And I said, hey, Joe, would you do a little talk and kind of talk about this for our meetup group? Because I'd love to kind of get more engaged in this. And he's like, sure. So I just kept twisting his arm and he agreed to do it. And so we threw it on the schedule. So I'm glad that people were also showed up to kind of find this valuable. So I'm Jess Lancaster. I work with James Fogarty to coordinate the Lansing area software testers meetups. And we used to do them in person and now they're virtual, which the virtual side has really, really helped us in the sense that we get to have cool speakers that are talented and get them to come in and speak to our group and also record these sessions for people to watch later on or go back to and reference. So don't feel like you have to take a ton of notes. We'll have this recorded for you. So Joe Orrs, I've known him since, 2014, maybe somewhere around there.
It's been a long time. It's been a while.
Yeah. So we were at, I think, KWS QA conference, and I think we were up there, and I met Joe there, and I think he was speaking, and I think that's the time it happened, because I remember us meeting there, and I was like, oh, I really want to speak at a conference, and you were like, hey, I do QA or the highway in Columbus, and he's like, yeah, just submit something, and so I did. It got picked up, and that was the first, I think, major talk that I did. I'd done a few other talks, but there, and it was the one on visual communication for software testers and stuff. I talked a lot about bugs and different things like that, and had a great time doing that. And so Joe is pretty instrumental in launching my recent, in the last 6 years, speaking opportunities. So I appreciate that for assistance there and helping me. But I'm going to do a little bit of introduction for Joe. You may want to add some things there. What is your actual title? Because I don't really know what that is now.
So I'm actually the director of modern software delivery at Centric Consulting. So, people are like, well, what is it? That sounds like a fancy title. What does that mean? Our modern software delivery practice is the term that we've given for a group of core competencies in IT. So we cover everything from agile application development, testing, DevOps, cloud, and how do you synergistically bring all of these technologies, all of these practices together to improve overall velocity and quality for teams today. So it's really exciting because in today's world, what we talk to businesses about all the time, and I'll get in my soapbox here for a second, is the number one thing from a business perspective is speed to market and speed to scale. And so how do you achieve that in a synergistic fashion? If you just focus, for example, on an agile transformation, that only affects how you manage the work, right? It doesn't actually affect how you engineer the work that you're doing. Doesn't necessarily always improve your bottom line velocity. And I think we've seen this in lots of places where people have undergone an agile transformation, but they're no closer to that state of predictable delivery, or the appearance of delivering faster comes from the incremental chopping up of work and not necessarily the overall delivery is any faster. Strategic projects for some organizations still take 2 to 3 years to complete. So we're all about how do you bring that stuff together. Again, we're a consulting firm, so run the gamut of helping to diagnose organizational challenges, going in, selecting tools, establishing governance and transformation roadmaps is kind of what we do. So I sort of head that up. So that's basically what I do in a nutshell. Thanks for the commercial.
Yeah. Thanks for adding some details there as to what you did, because I know you used to do a lot more work in the QA practice and things like that. And it sounds like it's expanded a bit more.
I did. And so that's probably a good thing to point out. Not that it's around this particular topic, but I always tell people, I grew up in the testing world. I spent the better part of my career, over 15 years, in the QA and testing world. I've done everything from the more technical side, test automation, performance testing, testing leadership, program management. And from there, I did move into true project management, Agile Scrum Master, moved into bigger strategic initiatives, all throughout my career. And testing has always been near and dear to my heart because At the end of the day, there are a lot of people who rely on the work that we do to provide them information so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not to release software, right? What's wrong with it? It's not only what is wrong with it, but what's the impact to my business? And so we play a very vital role from that perspective. So at Centric, I was first asked to stand up a testing practice, what I did, which is what I had done. But then this new thing of DevOps came along, right? And it's on the heels of agile transformation. And I'm like, you can't go fast in DevOps if you can't move fast with testing. And a lot of organizations, testing is a highly manual process. And I'm not saying that testing should be 100% automated, but where's the right balance that achieves optimal velocity and flow for an organization, and that fit right into DevOps principles. And so I picked up the DevOps practice inside of Centric as well as testing. And so because of that, I've always been able to make sure that testing is a first-class citizen. If you go to a lot of other firms, when they talk about these types of practices, for example, if you go to, and I don't mean to beat up on Accenture, right? But if you go to Accenture and you look at some of the offerings that they have, testing is not a first-class citizen. It's a second tier sort of service that they offer. We want to make it first and foremost because a lot of organizations, you can make or break your DevOps tool chain, the velocity you're trying to achieve with what you do in testing. Even from an agile perspective, if you want to eliminate a huge source of defects, there are testing related practices that you need to implement, amigos meetings, acceptance criteria, that BDD style approach. So you have to look at testing, you have to look at testing as being in part of the quality umbrella, right? It's an inspection activity. So how do you improve quality on the team? Well, one, you have to build it in. Quality is an outcome of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
You can't inspect quality in. We all know that. So how do you install the right practices that make sure that you're building things that achieve quality on the outcome? But then how do you provide those inspection points? And then it goes beyond testing, right? It's everything from, are these good requirements? Are they clear? Are they ambiguous? Are we writing code the right way? Are we doing it the same way across our teams or even within our team? So there's lots of different things that feed into that. And you have to keep your quality program front and center or you won't have quality.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So
appreciate you
thanks for
sharing
the,
that,
yeah.
those details for the kind of intro, and a little bit about what you're doing at Centric. And I also like just kind of pile on there too with Joe is a noted conference speaker as well, and so that's kind of where we kind of connected in the community and just have valued his thoughts and opinions as a colleague in the industry. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit more about psychological safety. So we should probably just pop into that
Yeah,
topic.
let's go ahead and do that.
And this, I just want to start this from the outset too. This isn't just presentation. This is going to be like discussion too, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. Is like what is people's experiences related to psychological safety.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I, I love the concept of psychological safety. I think it's very important for high performing teams. Am I the world's foremost expert on it? Absolutely not. The presentation today is going to be a little brief because I do think collectively one of the things about psychological safety is listening and hearing the experiences of others. And so Jess and I have set this up intentionally to be a brief sort of overview. And if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about the things that we're going to go over in the presentation. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time either on a specific slide or afterwards just talking about people's experiences, or people can raise questions about what to do in certain types of situations that would help you achieve psychological safety. So we're going to talk briefly about defining it. We'll then talk about some of the impacts on performance, give you some clues on how you can tell if your organization has psychological safety. And then we'll talk a little bit about what impacts the perception of psychological safety. And this is one of those things that's a little weird because perception is reality. And so we have to, when it comes to things like psychological safety, we have to manage perception more so than we have to manage reality. And so that's an interesting topic in and of itself. So
Yeah.
how many people, yeah, go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to say, and just to add on to that too, is like, I think talking to a group of people that are largely in the software testing arena too, like there's been a lot of challenges with psychological safety for testers on teams for years, right? Because they tend to be like outnumbered or even at times viewed as second class citizens. So we may get into some of those conversations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. How many of the folks here on the call have you guys heard of psychological safety? Are you familiar with the term? Do you know what it means? Wendy, Kelly, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark said yes.
Mark said yes. Okay. Awesome. Well, let's talk about a little bit about the down and dirty simple definition. You can Google the interwebs and you can find lots of things, but it does boil down to sort of this sort of quote, and we'll have a slightly more formal definition here in a second. But um, if you don't have trust on your teams, you don't actually have a team. And so if you think about this, there's no one single person that is responsible for delivering a piece of software, right? Taking that idea that gets transferred into a story that we then develop acceptance criteria for, we then develop, we validate, release and deploy to the customer and get their feedback and say, is this good or bad? There's not one single person who's responsible who solely makes that happen, right? The rare example might be a startup of something like Twitter in the early days, but I guarantee I think that was two people who started it, not one, right? But if you don't have trust on those teams, if you can't trust the person working next to you to do what they need to do and to communicate with you effectively, then you actually have no productivity because you have no trust on your team. And we'll talk about how that all works in here. Jesse, you want to go to the next slide? So
Sure.
the definition that you guys can walk away with is this here, right? Psychological safety is the belief that you won't be punished when you make a mistake. That's probably the easiest, most digestible form of this definition that you can find out there. How many people have felt like if you made a mistake in your organization that there would be negative repercussions for it? Has anybody experienced that before?
Yes, at prior organizations I have.
I'm sure everybody will say yes at prior organizations, right? I call this the fear of the invisible stick, and you can see this across multiple places in the organization. It's not just testing, it's not just your specific agile team, but when people are afraid of making a mistake, they're like, oh, we can't do that because so and so will be mad. That's a clue that you don't really have psychological safety in your organization. So anytime you have fear creeping into the organization and people fearing interactions, they're fearing outcomes, they're fearing other people's opinions, fearing not being heard. At the end of the day, that means you have absolutely zero psychological safety in the organization. So this is an easy definition that you guys could probably walk away with. So we're going to move through some of these pretty quickly here. So, as I kind of alluded to before, without that trust, those teams are not going to have very good productivity. And it's not just me that says it. I should have put the reference on here. I think it's actually buried in the notes, Jess, of, a study that shows, and
Okay.
very basic here. In most organizations, you might have a third of the people who say my opinion counts, right? The other 2/3 of the people in the organization often feel like my opinion doesn't count. And so those folks um, who have that opinion, who feel like I don't really count, people ignore my opinions, uh, they tend to have lower engagement with the teams, and that lower engagement leads to lower productivity and it leads to higher turnover. It can also lead to groupthink, right? If people are afraid to speak up, then only one opinion comes out and only one opinion matters and everybody follows that. And so if you can double the number of people who say, yes, my opinion counts in an organization, right? Going from 30% to roughly 60%, what you're going to find is you'll have less turnover, you'll have higher productivity, you'll have fewer safety incidents. It's just all around the board that having or missing psychological safety is just hugely detrimental to an organization. But it's one of those ethereal, abstract concepts that it's hard to say, what, it means, this many widgets. The best data I could find was actually around safety incidents when people evaluated manufacturing facility and they talked about psychological safety. those that had better psychological safety had 40% fewer safety incidents than those that had low psychological safety. And so that's just an example, but in knowledge work where it's a little more abstract, that same thing still appears in productivity on Agile teams today. So the question is, going to the next slide, and this is probably some good information for you guys, which is how can we tell if we have psychological safety in an organization? Well, first and foremost, going back to the definition, if you make a mistake and it's held against you, you do not have psychological safety in your organization. If people are afraid to bring up tough issues and talk about them, then you don't have psychological safety on your teams. And the way we see this as testers most often is if people are afraid to talk about bugs, right? If you log a defect and they immediately get defensive or you feel like you're being attacked, that's a clear indication that you really don't have psychological safety in your teams, right? We should be able to talk about things and talk about tough issues without fearing like somebody's going to, get mad at us or verbally assault us in a meeting or talk passive aggressively behind our back. If we live in those types of environments, then clearly there isn't psychological safety, in that organization. If your ideas and your statements or other people's statements are dismissed out of hand, that's another indication that you don't have psychological safety in your team. And sometimes we see this as subtle, rejection, passive aggressive rejection measures, right? And sometimes it's just based on who you are. It's based on your differences in the organization. So Jess, you brought up the great phrase earlier about testing being a second-class citizen. That phrase in and of itself indicates that you have experience with organizations that don't have psychological safety. If because you didn't get a CIS degree and you didn't come up from development, therefore your opinion doesn't matter as much as the developers, you're being rejected for being different, right? Or even on development teams, if they move a developer into testing and say, you know what, you're going to do testing now because you're either too junior or you're not good enough to be a developer, that kind of classism, if you will, right? Classifying people for being different, having slightly different viewpoints, that also indicates that you don't have psychological safety in your organization. So some other things, right? Taking risk. If you don't feel like you can take a risk on your team without getting in trouble, that's also another indication that you don't have it. So you should feel safe to take a risk. So as an example, if you're a manual tester and you want to play around with some automation and you download a tool and you try it out and you share what you find with the team, and you've still completed all of your other work, people should not be beating you up for quote unquote wasting time. Right? They should be embracing the fact that you're learning and you're trying to find ways to continually improve on the team and improve the overall team velocity. If they're not doing that and they're not supportive of that, then you really don't have that in your organization. If you can't ask people for help and actually receive it, there's kind of two components for this. One, if you're afraid to ask, that's a problem. If you do ask, but nobody ever helps you, that's also another problem, right? If that's a recurring predominant theme on your teams. What else? If you guys have people who will actively undermine your efforts on a team, that's also an indication that you don't have psychological safety. And so this is my way of saying, if you've got people who act passive aggressively, that's a very toxic environment overall. So we'll just leave it at that. And then finally, right, this is the whole value statement. If you are not a valued member of the team, if people don't appreciate the unique skills, the unique experiences, the talents that you have, if they are not valued and included as a part of kind of a diverse thinking, then you don't have psychological safety, right? And this is really, really important because most testers find themselves in the testing community, usually not necessarily by choice, but by chance, right? Nobody in this day and age typically goes to school and gets a bachelor's degree in software testing. In fact, I think only Kim offers that in Florida, right? And I think it's only a class; it's not a full degree program, right? So there aren't many people who go to school and say, yes, I want to work in the quality assurance field. I want to be a tester. We end up there because we're really good at what we do in terms of using the system, right? Where that's super admin, or we're super intuitive about what's going on, or we're really, really good with customers and we understand the customers. And so people want us to bring those skills into the testing community. And so at first that feels great until you realize that the rest of the team doesn't really care, right? They're just like, get the test case done, right? Tell us the pass fail status. So these are some clues to kind of clue you in as to whether or not you have organizational safety, psychological safety on your teams. You can just do a mental checklist and, ask this. I'll take a pause here and say, has anybody has an experience, do you have an experience that you want to share where you did not have psychological safety on your team?
Doesn't have to be at your current employer either, right?
Correct, correct. Nobody wants to share today?
I would share one. Years ago I worked for a small software development company and was the only tester there, and it was around the time that agile was like becoming a thing, right? So we didn't have the agile practices, so we're still largely in waterfall. And when the I was we was a small development team, probably about 6 or 7 developers, and me as the tester, kind of building out a program for testing and I would do testing on the products. I would always like notice that if like there was a quality problem or a bug that got through, they would be like, well, what are you doing wrong? Like, how did you not catch this? It's you're the tester. You're supposed to find this. And, it wasn't even until, I don't know, some years later when I went to a presentation where they talked about like combinatorial explosion and all these other things, like how it's like literally impossible to work all the bugs out of software, that I realized that, well, so it couldn't have all been my fault. I was like a member of the team, but they viewed me as like quality and transferred that to me, that ownership, right? As opposed to them owning it because they were building it. So yeah, in a sense. So I just felt like that wasn't a very safe environment, for me as an individual tester.
Yep. I've experienced when I've been at some organizations, I've experienced where they don't want you to log any intermittent bugs, right? Because they're like, well, if you can't reproduce it, you didn't see it in the first place. And so that becomes a little demoralizing because, I take my job very seriously when I'm testing software. If I see something, right, I don't call it a defect out of the gate, right? Call it an observation, right? If I observe something, then I want to bring it to people's attention. Just because I don't know how to recreate it doesn't mean, I didn't observe something. And so I've been in organizations where they've been adamant about you can't do that, right? If you can't reproduce it, you can't log it. And so that becomes a little demoralizing too. Um, the biggest thing that I find frustrating in these sort of toxic environments is probably one we've all experienced, but we seldom talk about, which is they don't respect the time it takes for us to do our work. Right? We are asked to, give us your right, waterfall world, give us your estimates for testing. Well, it's going to take 6 weeks, right? Even on an agile team, right? Sometimes they'll keep developing features until the last day of the sprint and then say, go test, right? And so they don't respect the time that it takes to complete the work. And they're just like, well, you just need to work over, right? You need to work in the evening or you need to work over the weekend to catch back up. That doesn't feel like a team that values me as an individual because we're not in it as a team. It's the team dumping crap on you and you having to take the short end of the stick. So, I find that, very, very frustrating. And I'm of the opinion that, what, if a tester has to work overtime, everybody works overtime, right? We've all got to be accountable for our work. And it's okay for developers to go overtime, but it's not okay for testers to go overtime, right? How many people have experienced that? I should see everybody's hand go up.
Joe, to just build off that analogy real quick, or that thought, like in an analogy, what I thought before, it's like, I imagine like the development team being like a baseball team and you're out there on the field, like the last inning comes, like it's like the team is trying to win. And like, in that sense, like you're still out there on the field. Like, I don't know, you're like out in left field or whatever, standing there, and the game is all finished, like everything's been done, and you're still out there trying to finish, right? And then everybody else is just gone, right? And the
Yeah.
stadium shut down or whatever. And it's like the team wins or loses, the individuals don't, right? So
Hmm.
it just, when I think about that, I think about that analogy of just like you're leaving some people out on the field and you're gone, right? You're moving on to the next game or whatnot. So
Yep. So yeah, so those are some great examples.
any other, I would wonder if there's anybody else that has things to share about any of the items that are on the screen that they've had experiences with in the past. So
It's a
let me just
quiet
throw this
group.
out real quick. As yeah, it's a little bit quiet. So let me just talk about let's talk about vulnerability for a moment. Part of psychological safety is like vulnerability is a part of that. So being more open and more transparent, as you can see with some of the things that are on the list, like it's safe to take a risk, it's safe to speak up, and things like that. So we just know that we're making this a safe space for you to share as well. So if you have anything you want to share, like embrace psychological safety by being vulnerable and sharing something from your past.
I got I mean, there's lots of stories that I could talk about.
Yeah, we're here to
You know,
listen, though. I think maybe Mark
yeah,
wanted to talk.
yeah,
Well, I mean, it's a lot similar to what you already expressed, Jess, but the one that keeps coming to my head is being on a production call on a Sunday morning after there was a problem. We did Sunday morning deployments where they had to shut down the system. So it comes back online and there's problems and it turns into a fire, and they've got the developers and management, everyone's on the call, and the VP gets on, and so we're here trying to resolve the problem. There's 30 people on the call and the VP says, "So did you test this? Was this tested? How did you miss this in testing?" And I almost hung up the phone call because I'm solve the problem and then ask how we can do better next time. It was a really frustrating situation to be in.
yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, beyond being frustrated, how did that make you feel in terms of how much effort you wanted to extend, to the team on a going forward basis, right? Or at least,
Yeah.
loyalty to that person.
Well, right. So you end up working in a CYA mode, cover your tail mode, to make sure that you're not going to be blamed for something that is out of your control.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest. I've been in that situation before where people are like, well, how did you miss this in testing? And, I flat out blurted out in a meeting. I'm like, well, how did you create this in the first place? Right. I didn't create it. Right. And,
Exactly.
you can't test everything. So at that point, um, I just became, adamant in that organization. I'm like, I'm not working I'm not working over. I'm not working in the evenings. I'm not working on the weekends. If you want something, it's going to have to wait, till Monday. And it just became such a toxic environment. And I was feeding into it, right? I'll own my responsibility. My response to that situation certainly didn't help things. But it quickly accelerated to the point I'm like, I can't work here anymore, right? And I ended up leaving the organization as a result. Um, and so that becomes really tough. So uh, I know from my own personal experience that I can be petty, right? And if people are going to be pissy to me, as I call it, right, I'm going to be petty back to them. Um, but that causes something to change in your brain, right? It causes a jaded outlook on all future companies, all future interactions. Like at the mere hint that somebody's going to blame you for something, you're like, no, right? And then you start to shut down, right? Or you build up walls. And then it causes you to approach how you talk about defects differently, or how you talk about test cases, or how you talk about progress, right? You start setting up these defensive responses for accusations that haven't been made yet. I found myself, justifying in test reports things that weren't tested more so than things that were, right? Because I just wanted people to know It's possible there's going to be something here. Don't blame me. We made a decision as a team to do this risk-based approach, and we opted not to do these things, right? And so those things can persist long after an organization in which you experience that. And the more toxic it is, and the longer you're exposed to it, I don't want to overuse the phrase, PTSD, but it drums up and it creates this recording in your head that's easily triggered by another environment, just by something similar. Great, thanks for sharing that, Mark. I mean, that's a great classic example. Why wasn't it caught in testing? Still sends shivers down my spine. I'm like, why did you create the bug in the first place? See, I can't even get off the topic now.
Well, and it's not always necessarily that somebody created the bug, but we have to appreciate the fact that, the system that Mark was talking about is like, if there's 30 people on the call, that probably has some indication about the complexity of the system. And like, how can you assure that there's not going to be any issues, right? It speaks a bit more to the I guess the maturity of the process for ensuring that there's not going to be any issues, right? Whether there's automation and monitoring and system checks and other things along the way that can alleviate that, as opposed to pointing the, like, I guess the way I think about it too is that how I might have left that opportunity is, kind of called back to, okay, here's the problem that we did have. And as you were saying, Mark, the right approach to that is saying, well, how can we not do this next time? And say, well, here's the proposal of all the stuff that we should have in place so that this doesn't happen. And then if the leaders don't decide not to do that, then those issues moving forward are on them once they're informed about it, right? So I don't know, but it is tough to not take those things personally when it's like directed toward you.
Awesome. We want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
So when it comes to psychological safety, because we're talking psychology, it all boils down to people's perception. There's always the reality and there's always the perception, but in the case of psychology, perception is reality, and it's the thing that we have to manage. And so there's a couple things we need to be aware of that can affect how people view you, or view the organization, view your team around psychological safety. And the first is the overall attitude about inclusiveness, right? What people do and say indicates what comments and feedback are welcome. And actually, in some ways, it also indicates which ones are not. And so a great example of this is you have to be careful when you're facilitating a meeting in which you want to parking lot an item, because the tone and inflection by which you parking lot something will tell people whether or not is it okay to do some brainstorming and populate a parking lot in a meeting, or is it not, right? Or is a specific idea not really welcome in this conversation and maybe not ever be welcome? So that attitude towards overall inclusiveness, I value your opinion, I want to hear what you have to say. And in the communication process, there's the person who says something, right? Communicate something. Then there's the people who receive it. And that response feedback is what tells you what's welcome and not welcome. So being inclusive and inviting people to provide their opinion and then welcoming that opinion in doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but welcoming that in creates that perception of inclusiveness, which drives people feeling like, oh, I can say what I need to here and be okay with it. I have this habit of jumping all over the place in my mind. So when I'm in that mode and I know that, I'll inform people of, hey, I'm going to jump around here because I haven't fully solidified my thought around this topic. So apologies if it's going to be all over the place, right? And people who are receptive are like, yeah, no problem. If you're not, you'll see people like rolling their eyes like, oh, here we go again. Joe's going down a tangent, right? That tells you that that's not an inclusive environment. So the next one here is people's perception of trust in collective responsibility. And so this is a really, really tough one. So Jess, earlier you mentioned, being on the field, right? The rest of the team's packed up and you're out there as a one-man show trying to finish out the game. That's not collective responsibility, right? That's a team that's putting all of the accountability onto the individual and not onto the team itself. And so anytime you have individual responsibility at play, individual responsibility tends to result in blame. You're responsible for this. Mark, what they were saying is it was your responsibility to find 100% of the defects in the system, right? There wasn't a collective level of accountability that you were driving to, which is, hey, a defect made it through. How do we prevent this in the future? Right? That wasn't the conversation. The conversation was you failed to do your job, right? And so the moment that you say that, that's individual blame. And that's just destructive to overall team morale, individual productivity, engagement, creates all sorts of issues. So having the team say, you know what, our entire team is accountable for quality. We are all accountable for what we deliver. We take pride in the work in which we do. And I think this is great from an agile perspective because there's been this big push towards team accountability for delivery, right? But we also need to have team accountability for quality as well because it's an outcome of what we produce. It's not an individual responsibility, it's a collective responsibility. And so we have to make sure that the team buys off on that. And this is why I always love it when teams put quality into the definition of done. We're not done with a story until we've tested it the way that we said that we're going to test it. And we're not cutting that corner. If we can't finish the testing, then the story's not done. We pull it out of the sprint. I know in some organizations that's hard to do, but in really high performing teams where you have psychological safety, that very much is a part of what they do. So collective responsibility results in getting work done and results in high engagement, high productivity, but individual responsibility always results in blame. So that's something to remember. Openness and communication, right? If people can't be open about communication, right? I talked about passive aggressive behaviors before. That's not being open with communication, right? Passive aggressive is a way of communicating when you know your communication will otherwise be accepted. And so you do it through other means. So if you don't have very good openness with communication, you'll have people that will hide things. You won't have transparency. People won't ask for help. People won't offer help. You will never have an idea of what your true progress is. You end up with what I call our watermelon projects. They often look green on the outside, but when you look at what's going on, the project is really red. And those always flip, right? They never go from, green, yellow, red. They're always one or the other. And so I call those watermelon projects. But the other side of it is if you don't feel free to openly communicate in the organization, you're not going to have good knowledge transfer. So if you need somebody to do something for you, you're not going to have backup. And then that leads to people, hoarding their specialized knowledge of saying, you know what, I'm authority in this area, only I can do it. You're dependent on me, and you're not going to dismiss me, right? And people don't feel free to share. This is one of the, taking this at a meta level. This is the difference between corporate software and open source software. Open source software is the value is in the collective in producing this. In a corporate software that you're selling, a lot of times it is the value is in keeping this internal with what we're doing. And I'm not saying that software shouldn't be licensed, right? Red Hat's made a ton of money on top of an open source product. So there's a way to monetize that sort of a approach. And again, for those of you in the software world, I'm not poking fun at corporate licensed software. Just taking it to that meta level. Communities grow a lot faster when there's openness and sharing. So if you want to grow a community inside your organization, you have to open it up. There is corporate software that has very robust communities around it, right? It's still closed software, but they have robust communities. Salesforce is probably a good example, right? And it's an entire platform. They license their software, but they've got a very robust community that shares in that knowledge. That openness and communication is what makes that happen. So we've talked a little negatively about experiences where people have experienced a situation in which there wasn't psychological safety. What about when there was psychological safety, when you felt free and able to voice your opinion? Do you guys have examples of that you could share with folks and what made you feel a valued member of the team? I'll let you guys think about that, and I'll share a story that I have from my career. When I started out in my career early on in testing, I used to be in the Navy. When I got out of the Navy, I went to work for a defense contractor as a tester, testing the software and the hardware of the equipment that I operated on in the Navy. So I was very familiar, with this particular piece of equipment. And so one of these times, we got a new software release that we needed to test. And this software, I'll give you some of the details because I think it's important. What it did is it controlled the launching of flares and chaff on a ship to defend the ship against incoming missiles. Flares are basically heat-seeking. They're really flares that float in the air that burn really hot. And so for missiles that lock onto heat signatures, hopefully they would lock onto that decoy. Chaff is basically throwing up a bunch of foil confetti in the air. So if you have a missile that's using radar, it'll be confused by the cloud and go for the cloud as opposed to your ship. And so I was working and testing the software, and they were introducing some new algorithms to do some automated deployment of these things, because prior to the software, it was all manual. So I, as an operator, had to determine which side of the ship I wanted to launch things from, and there was things that we had to know in order to do that. So the software was like, well, let's take this out of the hands of the operator, and we could do this automatically because we know the ship direction, we know the wind speed, we know the characteristics of what we're trying to do, so it just should be automated. So it was going to be a really, really great sort of thing. During one of the test cases, one of the things that I came up with is, well, what happens if you launch it and it blows back on the ship? Would the software allow you to launch something that would cause it to blow towards the ship, which would defeat the purpose of doing that? So long story short, came up with the test case. I actually had to write some programs. This is way back when. I had to write some programs in C to calculate distances. If you remember the distance formula for high school, I did use high school math outside of high school. But also had to use some physics for drift and how long it took, for things to drift down, because these were all gravity, air buoyancy and that type of stuff. Anyway, I found an edge case in which you could actually, the ship, the software would launch a flare in the air, and then it would slowly drift back towards the ship, and it would actually either land on the ship or land slightly behind the ship, which would do nothing but draw the missile to the ship itself. And so I presented this to the engineers, and this was a third-party company. So in the military, they have true independent verification and validation organizations that do testing that is separate from the engineering team that creates the software. Two separate companies, two separate contracts. So it was really interesting. So first time on the job, first big bug that I found. And so I sent over the test case, what I was trying to accomplish, and my findings for it to the engineers. And the engineers came back and said, basically to the effect, we like what you're thinking of, but the formula that you're using is incorrect. And so they pointed me to some references to tweak, my distance formulas and drift formulas. And so first of all, I appreciated that they were willing to take me seriously, knowing that this was my first year on the job as a tester, and the only C programming I had was a couple of college classes. So, lots of things could have gone wrong, right? How many of us have done automation in which we find something only to find it's our automated test? It's not the code itself. And so they pointed me in the right direction, and so they allowed me to continue exploring that test case. The net result is I retweaked it, went back through, and actually found a whole series of edge cases in which these weird scenarios could happen that would be detrimental, brought them up to the engineers. They reviewed my work. They appreciated it. They accepted it. And so they were very open and inviting from that perspective. And so I felt like, okay, I might be new, but they're valuing what I do. The outcome of that program, just to show you how important this was, it actually shut down the entire program for 18 months because it triggered an engineering review, which I knew nothing about, as a tester, but it triggered an engineering review because now they're like, the requirements appear to be all wrong. Our thought processes appear to be all wrong as a result of this, one defect that I found. But the fact that that third-party company whose contract was on the line was willing to acknowledge what I was providing, the information, and even though I was wrong in my first time, they gave me information so that I could be correct and reevaluate what I was doing and provide, good information. I mean, that made me feel really, really good as a tester, and I carry that everywhere I go today. That's so monumentally important that you allow people to explore things. And even when they're wrong, you don't dismiss the idea that they were trying to pursue in the first place. You help them refine it and correct it and get to where they need to be. And it's just was really, really great. And so I use that as a litmus test for psychological safety, for myself. Are you willing to accept criticism from somebody else, and even though you find something wrong with what they're saying, you give them enough information to come back and still be critical of the work that you're doing? That's a true open environment. Anyway, that's a long-winded story. I'd love to hear somebody else's.
Well, I have one that just happened recently. I'm in mobile testing, and as we're all familiar with iOS just released iOS 14. Well, what I try to do is I download the betas, so I'm ahead of the game. So to see if there's any effect on any of our mobile apps. Well, I had gotten up, I think, to beta 5, and I run through and everything looked good. So the team's like, how is everything looking? I said, everything's looking good. There might have been a couple things that, we were like, well, we'll see how it looks in the next beta, because that can change. Well, I said, well, they usually go to like beta 5. Once in a while, they'll go to beta 6. Well, anyway, they did go to a beta 6. And I just wrapped up some testing with it. And then iOS 14 was released. Well, then we started getting customer calls in that if they took a landscape video, it was fine. But if you took a portrait video, the picture, the video displayed very small. I'm going to say like just slightly larger than a thumbnail size. So the team, we all got together, and I'm already beating myself up. I'm like, I know I tested that. But no, none of the team said that to me. They just said, what are we going to do about this? So I went through and I'm like, yep, I can duplicate it. But then iOS, the beta is out for iOS 14.2. So I downloaded that. Guess what? Magically, it's fixed. But 14.2 isn't going to be released to the customers for quite a while. So what we did is we went ahead and got stats just to find out how many of our customers do portrait videos. And then the team made a decision. Okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to fix this. Well, I mean, the team got together. Everyone got together. Project manager, developers, myself. And they're like, we're going to test. Well, they took an earlier beta that I had, and it worked. So they had said, earlier betas, it worked. And somehow Apple's seen this, and now they're going to correct it. But I just thought it was really nice for the team not to come at me and say, didn't you test this? Did you, giving me drilling down on what I did and how I did it. They didn't. They just said, we're just going to go ahead and how can we fix this? So I feel with my team, I have good psychological safety with them. I mean, they're not going to come at me and blame me for things. They're more like, what can we do to solve this?
Mm-hmm. And how committed are you to helping them if they ask you for help? If they're like,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I've helped them a lot. They've come to me because we have done machine language training our systems how to understand different videos and things. And so they've come to me and they said, would you go out and just get all these different kinds of videos, and would you help me train? And I'm like, absolutely. Absolutely. Or if they sit down and they're working through a problem and they say, hey, I don't understand this. Can we work together on this? Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes it, I mean, we talk about it, in abstract terms, but I mean, at the end of the day, it makes real dramatic, impacts on, productivity and morale, creativity of thought in terms of, how to solve problems. Just makes a world of difference.
Absolutely. And we tend to come together and discuss things. So I really like that. And they value my opinion on things just as they value each other's. And sometimes they don't agree with me, and that's fine. They make good points, and I'm like,
Yep.
okay, let's try it.
Yep. That actually leads us into some stuff we're going to get into here in a couple of slides, which are some pitfalls to avoid. But I know we're running long on time here, so I want to cover this.
Just a couple minutes left. Yeah.
Couple minutes on some things that you guys can do to create an environment in which you have psychological safety in your teams. Whether you're in a leadership role or an individual contributor role, you can do this. So one is always try and drive towards collective responsibility around what the team is trying to do, not an individual, right? It's all about we. It's not about you or me. Hard one to do sometimes. Make sure a task conflict does not boil over into a relationship conflict. So Wendy, you were talking earlier about the ability to voice your opinion and be wrong. To some degree, you need to have the ability to voice an opinion and have a disagreement and have it be about the task and not about the person. That's really, really important, is avoiding the personal nature that things can sometimes boil into. Frame all work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. So if you fail, and I actually think this down somewhere later, I think I say this, failure is not failure. Failure is learning, right? And if you view failure as failure, you don't have the right environment. It's just learning. It didn't work the way we thought. We learned something. Jess, you mentioned earlier being vulnerable, right? That includes acknowledging your own fallibility. We're not always right, but being okay to say, you know what, I was wrong, right? Sorry, I screwed up, right? And people being, okay, that's fine, and moving forward, that creates, that camaraderie that you need on the team, that creates that trust. Model curiosity and ask lots of questions. The key about asking questions is to make sure it's not an interrogation. It's about curiosity, seeking to understand, not seeking to point out when somebody's not done something right. So model curiosity and ask lots of questions is good. Being vulnerable, asking for input, responding positively to questions, doubts, and skepticism. So if somebody is skeptical of your point of view, responding with openness and positivity is going to be really key. With that, forgive and reframe, right? So if somebody does something wrong, acknowledge it as a learning opportunity. It's not a reflection of them. It's not a reflection that they failed. It's not a reflection that the team failed. The team learned something, right? Adopt the whole Einstein made-up quote, right? He learned 999,000 ways to not, create a light bulb, right? Whatever that quote is really that sort of thing that we want to embody, right? Every time we don't achieve what we want to, we've learned something new. And then on the next slide, if you want to go to the last one here, is be careful that we don't confuse psychological safety with being nice, right? We should always be nice and polite, but being nice to somebody does not create psychological safety. I can be passive aggressive and be nice to them. Doesn't mean that I value their opinion or I allow them to openly speak, right? You also don't have to accept low performance. If someone is not performing in a psychological safe environment, you're able to have that conversation around what that performance is, how it's not meeting expectations, and what can be done to improve it without it being a reflection of the person themselves, right? It's low performance about the task, not low performance of the individual. Now, there are times where it is about the person and you have to address that differently. But from a culture perspective, the focus should be on the performance of the task, not the performance of the individual. Never hold back your thoughts. If you feel like that you have to bite your tongue and not say something, that's an indication something's going, is amiss. So having a psychological safe environment doesn't mean withholding conflict, right? Or avoiding conflict or quickly resolving it for the sake of resolving it. Conflict should be managed. Conflict leads to diverse thoughts. If you think about it, the mere phrase diverse thoughts means you have thoughts that aren't in agreement, and that's okay, right? You want that. We talk about this country being founded on the diversity of thought and debate. We want that in our teams, right? That spurs creativity. That causes people to reevaluate their positions. It exposes things that people hadn't previously conceived of. And if you hide those thoughts, you won't get there. The always agreeing or just agreeing also is not helpful. That's not a psychologically safe environment. And then holding back your emotions. We are all allowed to have our emotions. We also have a responsibility in how we respond to those emotions, but we are all allowed to feel the way that we feel. If we feel that somebody is being mean or dismissive to us, that is a valid emotion to feel. What you do in response to that is what indicates a psychologically safe environment, right? Going and talking to people about how you feel and having them hear you, right? That requires two-way trust, two-way participation in that conversation. And so psychological safety is not about one person, it's about all the people in the organization. So you don't have to hold back your emotions if you have a psychologically safe environment. Feel free to share them. Let people know that you've been hurt, that you've been angered, that you feel dismissed, that you feel undervalued, that you feel underappreciated, and why that is.